my name is Carshonda Baker. I am the Director and CEO of the Goldsboro Westside Community Historical Association, Incorporated, and I'm here with one of my favorites,
Sonya, Mallard, Coach Center Coordinator.
Actually, my favorite over here in Mims at the Harriette and Harriette V. Moore Cultural Complex here in Mims. And we have a direct connection to Goldsboro as well.
Correct.
And I want you to tell the people why the history of the Moores is so important and why Mr. Moore and Mrs. Moore were really before their time.
Harry and Harriette was so important because he had the audacity to do the unthinkable when it was a scary time for a black man to do. He fought for three things. He fought for equal pay for black teachers at a time when black teachers were getting paid much less than their counterparts. He fought against the lynchings that took place in the state of Florida. Mm-hmm. Come on, Portia.
Yes.
I thought it was Tennessee or Alabama, but it was the state of Florida.
That number one.
Number one.
That's right.
And then he taught his students how to cast ballots. And I'm proud to tell you that we're a voting polling place right here today.
Yes. Yes. And I think the magnificence of the Moore, one, is what you all did to bring his legacy to the forefront. That's one. That's a testament to you and Miss Cassandra here as well. But this is a beautiful facility. How many square feet do y'all have over here?
5,000 square feet.
And a beautiful cultural complex that commemorates the history and teaches the American history of why he's so valuable to not just black history.
Correct. We cover a timeline museum from 1860, the Emancipation Proclamation, all the way to 1964, the Civil Rights Voting Act. And you know we're talking about that Voting Act today.
That's right, that's right. And we're talking about the injustices that still remain because the fight never ended.
Never. We're continuing it. The dream lives on.
That's right. And he was really one of Florida's first black activists. How many registered voters did Mr. Moore actually register?
Mr. Moore registered 116,000 blacks at a time when black men kept their head down. They had to cross the street when a white woman was coming. At a time that they felt, what, 1/5 a man?
That's right. That's right. And I want to kind of turn around and turn the camera around here so you'll be able to see a couple of things and tell us the story of why Mr. and Mrs. Moore are no longer here with us and what happened. Okay. So you told us a little bit about their legacy, about the three things that he really activated and did here in the state of Florida and in Central Florida.
Correct.
But tell us what happened.
Christmas Day, December 25th, 1951. You know how we celebrate Christmas, Pasha.
Yeah.
Family, food, laughs.
They still got a Christmas tree up.
Exactly. And the Moores did that as well. But what they didn't know was something evil was lurking in the groves, and it was the KKK. Not only was it Christmas, it was their 25th wedding anniversary.
That's right.
They came home. It was Mr. and Mrs. Moore. His mother was visiting and their oldest daughter. They was waiting to open up their presents the next day for Evangeline to come home off the train. About 10:20 p.m., boom! They said that was the loudest bomb heard around the world.
Yes.
Everyone from...
They thought it was the Hiroshima bomb that took out Japanese during one of the wars that we had.
Correct, correct. And people from as far as Scotchmore came running, Titusville came running. They said, Professor Moore's house, Professor Moore's house. Listen, that dynamite was so explosive that it took Harry and Harry's body, lifted them up into the ceiling, imprinted, and caved into the ground. They couldn't call 911. You know what, Pasha?
Why couldn't they call 911?
There wasn't a hospital here that would see a black man.
So where did they take him?
They dug him out. They took their limp bodies, put him in his car, and they drove down Highway 46 to the city of Sanford.
Not because, now remember, this is in early 1950s, 1951 to be exact. So when they took him from Mims, remember cars weren't the same?
That's right.
Nor were roads the same.
Correct.
And they were not in an ambulance.
Oh no, no ambulance.
No police cars, nothing that told you to move over, give these people the right of way because it's an emergency.
That's right, that's right. They had that pedal to the metal, and by the time they got to the city of Sanford, Harry was frantic. Doctor, do something. My husband living. Dr. Starks was waiting with a needle, and they pretty much gave Harry a needle on his side, but he was dead on arrival. Harriet, she lived 9 days later, and then on that 9th day, she died.
And the children lived, I think the last one just passed a few years back.
Correct. Evangeline Moore just passed away 5 years ago.
So we are here to learn more about the history of Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore and what they did. So now let's take a look in the actual museum, and you can see behind us a beautiful picture. This
Correct.
is very nice. You have it decorated so beautiful in
Thank
here.
you.
And
Thank
what are
you.
y'all opening hours? And they are part of the Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network here of Central Florida. And so we have over 30 plus Black museums that you can go and visit. Please come and take a tour with the one and only Mrs. Sonya Mallard. Her coordinator as well, Miss Cassandra, is going to show us around the museum. So I'm excited. So let's go.
Yes. And our hours are Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And on Saturday and Sundays, presently we're closed, but give us a call at 321-264-6595 for your special personalized tour.
And she does all the tours herself. And so when you come into the different Black museums around the state of Florida, we don't just tell you to go look on the wall. We tell you the stories and interactions behind what the memorabilia, the photos, the artifacts. We tell you what those mean and why it's important and why it's exactly in this museum.
Correct. And I like to call it the Moore experience.
I like the Moore experience. So let's go ahead and have the Moore experience. I love it, Miss Sonya. I love it. All right, let's go.
Okay. Look, are you behind now?
All right, Miss Sonya. So we are taking a tour here. All right,
So I like to always start here because I need people to understand the importance of these artifacts. These artifacts here were from Africa, and we want to tell people the importance about Africa. Now, most of the time when we talk about Africa, we don't talk about how our culture was stripped
that's
from
right.
us.
That's
And
right.
that's very
We were
important.
families.
People look
Visiting.
at African Americans and think that their life began with slavery, but in actuality, our life began here in Africa, where we had our own
Not just
culture.
our life, human life.
Yes, all life.
Because all life came from, and we can prove that, because the first woman was actually found
In Africa.
in Africa. That's right.
And we want to talk about this because the transatlantic slave trade dehumanized African people, and it made them nothing more than cattle. And this dehumanization and enslavement is what we talk about from the beginning. So here we have the African artifacts, and they became an enslaved people. They were not slaves.
That's right.
And then we move over to talking about the transatlantic slave trade, and we talk about how they treated us like cattle, which is the dehumanization of Africans. We see that this ball here, which weighs about 70 pounds, was actually, when you see this man here chained, the chain went through this hole, and he had to work with this on to prevent him from running away. And that is so important, because what we need to understand about slavery, especially when it came to the transatlantic slave trade, is it's about dehumanizing a group of people because of their race. They took us, they stopped us from being able to marry who we want to marry, and breeded us like we were cattle so that they could get the best slave for their purposes.
The labor.
Well, it wasn't really about labor. We talk about it being about labor, but if it was just about labor, they would have given us our own place to live, and we would have had to report to work from sun up to sundown. It was about dehumanization because they control every part of our life. They control who we marry. They control if we stayed married. They sold off our children. They sold off our husbands. They sold off our wives. if we didn't cooperate. And even if we did, we had no control over our own bodies and what they did. They tagged us, they branded us, and gave us names to make us feel like we were part of their society, but didn't want to teach us to read and write because they realized that we were very quick and adaptable to situations. And so all of this happened before.
And took away our culture and
heritage.
Yes,
well, when you came from Africa, remember, there's over 120 different languages spoken in
That's
Africa.
right.
So when we came here, they cut our hair, they took away all of our tribal markings, they gave us very common names that they could pronounce and they were used to having, so that they could strip us of being who we were and assimilate us into being who they wanted us to be.
Definitely.
So that was all part of the before we even talk about what happened from 1860 to 1964. And then when we start talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, this is important to note that the Emancipation Proclamation happened in 1863. When we talk about the end of slavery, that didn't happen until 1867 actually, because after 1865 there were two other states that actually still had slavery on the books. So we have to remember when we're talking about Emancipation Day. For Florida, it happened in 1865, May 20th.
Yes, 1 month prior to Texas.
Which we now celebrate as the end of slavery, which is Juneteenth, which is the May 19th. But every state had to wait for a cavalry that was reading this proclamation
on the
steps of the Capitol. And I think a lot of people don't know that. So
I'm glad you mentioned that, Ms. Cassandra.
Yes, because we want to make sure that our
FAAFN, Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network.
We actually use that because that was one of our initiatives, is to be truthful. Tell the truth about what happened in history. And this was one thing that we needed to be truthful about. It didn't all happen in 1863. It happened over years and years and years. And it took almost 3 years for it to happen. And even when we talk about the 13th Amendment as it akins to slavery, remember, the 13th Amendment doesn't actually end slavery the way that we think of it ending slavery. The 13th Amendment changes the format of slavery, and that's something we really need to think about when we're talking. We say abolishment, but what it really says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof a party shall have been duly convicted, should exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And these rights that we're talking about are, because they were ratified by 2/3 of the states at that time, that's what made them amendments. We have Voters' Rights Act because it was not amended by 2/3. So we have the 14th Amendment, and I want you to understand that that is a very important amendment because it does give you what citizenship is in America. It also tells you that if you're an immigrant, that you are afforded all of the rights of a citizen that was born here, except for being president. So that tells you a lot because a lot of people at that time were still immigrating to the United States. And then we have the 15th Amendment, which happened in 1870, that gave black men the right to vote. Women's suffrage came in the 1930s, but we need to really understand that these rules here, these amendments here, really were transformative in how we fought during the civil rights movement.
That's correct. That's correct. That's awesome. That's awesome. And you have the birth of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes, so this birth of the Klan here is not really truthful with this picture because this Klan was started in Pulaski, Tennessee as a social club. They looked more like soldiers, like this man here, Nathan B. Forrest. They didn't have to hide who they were. They didn't have to hide what they were doing because it was very socially acceptable for them to have this attitude
Without
and
the
think
hood.
the way that they were thinking. And when people use the word white in this era, right, those people were considered to be heretics. They were crazy because people were still being defined by their ethnicity. You still hear people talk about being Polish or being German or being Irish or Scottish or being French.
European whites.
European. But you didn't hear them define themselves as being white until 1915. So the Klan reorganizes in 1915. And when the Klan reorganizes, William J. Simmons and Atlanta physician Samuel Green actually bring out the modern Klan. The modern Klan always says to people, oh, we're not a hate group. I don't know why they keep calling us that. Because officially, they are a fraternal society. And that's something people should know. So they're like the Shriners, they're like any other Buffalo, any other fraternal society that we look at, which is something most people don't know. And they just don't direct their activities towards people of color, like blacks. They don't like any immigrants, Jews or Roman Catholics.
They don't like nobody.
If you are not Anglo-Saxon, if you are
But a
not
type of
Protestant,
Anglo-Saxon, yeah.
Yeah, if you're not a Protestant Anglo-Saxon, they're not interested. And I think that that's something people should know too, because so many times we think of the Klan and hate organizations of not having any real merit, but their whole reason for re-establishing themselves is fear. Because when the NAACP starts in 1909, people are starting to get along, people are starting to change their mindsets, people are really starting to look and think about how we want to shape and form America. And so many people enter this country that are not necessarily from England. And I want you to note that in 1909, the standard for being colored was not being from England. It is not until later on, in 1915, that we start to see white being used as a race. Because they have to keep their power structure. So in America, when we talk about race, what we're talking about is white, right? Being all non-melanated countries, and brown, and black, and Asian. Remember, all of these are lumped together.
Colored.
But then they don't want that because then that would be the majority. Think about it.
That's right.
So then they separate within those people. So you're either black, no Hispanic, Hispanic, black or white, and then you're either Asian or Pacific Islander. So you start to see that they want to keep us very separated because if they didn't, we would be the majority. And we have these events that happen in Florida, Ocoee, Rosewood. These were very affluent, thriving black communities that get ruined because of a lynching here in Ocoee that happens because a man wanted to exercise his right to vote.
Mr. July Perry.
Yes, Julius July Perry. And we want to make sure we understand that when America was starting, especially Florida, a lot of people, especially black people, came here because they were homesteading. They had large portions of land that they were able to give to their children an acre so that they could establish their own homestead. And so all of these places that were established had a very large and thriving black community that was being burned out because white people couldn't get the land any other way. So when we look at this in Ocoee, they burn him out. They get rid of all the people who were originally there.
Not get rid of.
They burn them.
That's right.
They burn them. And then what, 35 years, black people do not return to Ocoee?
And we still need to speak about, because we know the land.
Yes.
And one thing that's never spoke about, and I want to be clear here, when we speak of these tragedies, when we speak of Ocoee, Rosewood, when we speak of the Ku Klux Klan, and we're getting now to the Moors here, we know the people
Yes.
that were lynched.
Yes.
But who did the lynching?
We don't know it. Because
Who
it was
did
a
the burn?
crowd. It was a crowd of people. And because what they did when it came to the Klan, which is something that we found after investigation, was they would give out, in a Klan meeting, it would be 100 people. They would give out 20 slips of paper, right? But they would give out paper to anybody. Your job was on your piece of paper. You might get a blank piece of paper. They gave a piece of paper to everybody. But your job and what you were supposed to do was written on this paper. So that if they questioned you, you can really, if you give out a slip of paper to 100 people, right? You can really say, I don't know who did it. Because all you know is what your job was in the whole setup. So that's how they were able.
Each person played a role, huh?
Yeah, each person played their part, and that's how they were able to do and commit all these crimes. And then if somebody actually was found out, usually the people who were in charge were part of that organization. So nothing ever got prosecuted. And that's how things continue to roll out. All the way up to 1973, I think it was. I mean, people were still running on the platform of being a card-carrying Klan member up to 1973. That's a long time.
I would argue up to 2022, but okay.
Okay. So we get to Mr. Moore, and we see that he is starting the NAACP. But Mr. Moore is just more than the NAACP. When we talk about Mr. Moore, we have to think about it. He already was established as a teacher and a principal. He already had his own orange grove. So not only was he an employee, but he was an employer. And that really changes everything. So Mr. Moore had a 4-acre functioning orange grove that sold oranges to the local packing house
Here in Mims.
Yes, here in Mims. So that was the Fruitland Packing Company that they used to send oranges up north. So we really know that he was really established as a businessman. Mr. Moore didn't need to do what he did. And that was something that people need to understand. He and his wife were both school teachers. The home, although it's modest in size for us, it's 1,200 square feet. Back then, that's a mansion. Oh.
That he owned the land.
And he owned all 4 acres. So we have to look at it from a different lens. His wife continued to work. He, his wife, and both of his children were all college educated. So he didn't need to do what he did. He did it not for himself, because he had already achieved the American dream. He did it so that others who came behind him would have an easier time doing so. And so that is the inspiration when I look at him and go, wow. Even back then, he wasn't thinking just of himself. He was thinking of the future generations having an easier time.
That's right.
I mean,
here in the state of Florida.
Yes.
And here in Central Florida.
Well, it really rippled all the way throughout the United States, because he was known all throughout Europe. Remember, NASA at that time wasn't here. It was called the NACA, and they were doing the race to space. So they had gathered all the astrophysicists from all these different countries, Germany, Austria, just everywhere, that they could get people who were interested in trying to get to space. And where was those families living? In all of these little small towns and cul-de-sacs. They were living here. And this was their first time really being in America and talking about what really went on with the common man, rather than talking about the ideal that we were promoting, nationally, in other countries. So they were living it, and they were in rural South. Just think about that. Compared to what they're hearing about that's going on in the North, they're in the rural South. And they're writing home to their families about everything that is going on to this area. That's why when Mr. Moore's house was bombed, 5 countries wrote about his death. They couldn't believe everything that was going on. The Russian consulate spoke out about it. We had Eleanor Roosevelt who said this is not going to be a good thing. So we start to see that his influence not just rippled here in the United States, but it rippled to other countries. So he was not just, when we talk about, oh, it just happened here, it just happened in the United States. No, nothing happens in a vacuum. It all happens and it has far-lying effects that we don't really know until we get to the end. We're like, oh my God, 16 people from the Soviet Union flew in to attend his funeral. One of them even got up and spoke at his funeral. So we're not talking about a man who didn't have influence, not just in the United States, worldwide. And I think that's what we lose when we lose this bit of history, is that we lost that this was not just about the United States. This was not just about the rural South. This was a worldwide effort. It was the bomb heard around the world.
Yes.
These countries were interested in what was going to happen. That's why the FBI came here and investigated, because they had to satisfy, because they were trying to export this idea of Americanism to everywhere, but they're going to have to satisfy that Americanism is working for the Americans that are there. And if they don't satisfy that, no one is going to buy into the idea of America. So they send the FBI here. They investigate his bombing of his house. They send them to the funeral to make sure that no further bombings happen. And it was because of his bombing of his home that they all galvanized all these grassroots efforts that are working separately behind the NAACP, because that was his group of choice that he had chosen to follow. And they galvanized behind them, and raising that money in New York at the gala in March of 1952 is what gave them the funding to be able to do what they did in the civil rights movement. So this becomes the catalyst for them to start the civil rights movement. If it wasn't for the bombing of the Moore home, none of that would have happened.
It was the effect.
It was what happened.
The cause and effect.
That's right. It was the ripple effect of what had happened to the Moores.
That's an interesting point. That's a very interesting point.
Thank you very much. I'll call you later, and I didn't catch your name, so I'm gonna need that. When I call you, what's your name again?
Carshonda Wright,
Carshonda Wright.
better known as Lala.
Miss Lala. It's gonna be Miss Lala. Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt you. You were phenomenal. I'm gonna tell everybody that I can ask for you. Because, oh my God, you're the best.
I'm just really nerdy and I read a lot of books, and that's how I know all this.
I'm kind of the same way, so I felt like a kindred spirit. I thought it was great.
Thank
Have a great day.
you. You too. Yeah, I'm kind of nerdy. I know. I read a lot.
We love it, Laura.
I read a lot of
it.
books. I worked in a library before this. I worked in youth services, so I was always talking about this kind of stuff. And it was, I watched documentaries. I'm just a really nerdy person in general.
You're good. You're good. Let's keep going. All right. So we're here with the Board of Education in Brevard County.
Because he starts the NAACP here in Brevard County, and he has to write out for a charter, he starts corresponding with Thurgood Marshall. He becomes really good friends with Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall, remember, is an up-and-coming attorney at that time. He's looking for landmark cases. And he realizes in Moore, he has a person that he can teach to take affidavits, and that he can look out for cases that are going to be landmark and precedent setting. And so they find each other a kindred spirit. They become so much friends that that Mr. Thurgood Marshall comes and stays at the Moore house several times. And so that's something that most people don't know.
No, I didn't know.
Actually, when Mr. Moore died, Mr. Marshall came here and stayed and grieved with the family.
Well, he didn't die. He was killed.
Well, he was killed. When they had his funeral, he came here and grieved with the family for 2 weeks.
Really?
Yes. Mrs. Moore, Evangeline, the youngest daughter, has a painting that he gave her of himself because she was very smitten with him when she was a young girl. And he has a painting of her, and her son kept that. But really being able to be here and talk to Mrs. Moore about her family, about her father, really soaking up all of that personal knowledge, reading all of the books, talking to other people who were here in that era, gives me a very different perspective on how history is presented. It's a story, and it's not just what happens, it's what's going on in the backdrop of what's happening that you really have to know, because history is a living and breathing thing. It's not like this happens and then this happens. It's a continual thing, and the ripple effects is enormous. Just think about, we lost this history because in 1951 there's no television, right? The next year, 1952, television. That's how we start getting, we go from getting
news.
Our news from the newspaper and radio to television. We don't have any voice of Mr. Moore. We don't have any pictures of him standing and giving speeches because television hadn't been invented. And so we kind of lose that history when we transition from one form of getting the news to a new one. And when we got television, it became our major form of how we got the news. And that's why Mr. Moore's story kind of got lost in the shuffle, because not having him giving a speech, not having him, the picture, the image of him that is etched in everybody's mind, we lose it. But his contribution was so important because the magnitude of what happened was earth-shattering. It was everybody around the world going, look what happened. What are we going to do about it? And the United States decided that sending the FBI to investigate would be the best course of action. And then we see that Mr. Moore takes this story and files a lawsuit with his friend Gilbert with the Teachers Association, because he is the president of the Colored Teachers Association. And when he files this lawsuit, he doesn't win initially, but eventually they're able to get equal pay for teachers. And that is significant because usually in Brevard County, white students went to school 5 months of the year. Black students went to school 3 months of the year. Yet they are all expected to pass an exam to pass to the next grade level. And it's the same exam. Now, what was really interesting that I found out about education back then is that the state did not certify colored schools. The state certified white schools. The Southern Conference of Colleges gave the certification for the colored schools. So if you graduated from a colored school, especially high school, it was akin to having 1 year of college. When we decided that we were going to integrate, they took the lesser standard of the state school as the integration standard.
Interesting.
So you have to start thinking about exactly what you give up when it comes to these types of things. You get this, but you give up this. Life goes on. You don't know.
This is such a beautiful picture of her.
Yes, listen, I tell people all the time, I have 6 kids. I don't know how her husband came home and said, listen, honey, sit down. I have something I want to talk to you about. We're going to do this. I know it's going to put us in danger. I know, what's going to happen, but I really feel like
What do you think that conversation actually, because she's pretty, she's an educator,
yes.
and both of them were activists, and she definitely contributed to that 116,000 that he registered, setting up those NAACP branches, going out and sitting down to the table with Attorney Marshall. What do you think those conversations around that dinner table look like?
Boy, listen.
Dinner with the Moores. Now
that's,
I love it.
Like the most trustful and loving wife, because I have 6 kids. I'm gonna tell you now, if you threaten or make any sign that you might do something to one of my children, I would lose my mind. I would be behind bars. But this woman knew all the danger, knew everything that was going to happen, and still stuck by her husband. That is love beyond. Like, she loved him.
But this black love changed the nation.
Yes.
And like you said, had a ripple
trusted him
effect.
with not just her life,
Children.
but her life of her children.
Yeah.
And I just, we talked this game about love and being devoted, but if you're going to parent yourself after a marriage, this is the marriage.
It's ride or die, huh? It's ride or die.
She is ride or die. I'm telling you right now. Like, she was every step of the way and could not imagine her life without him. Because when they told her that she couldn't go to her husband's funeral, she said, "Oh no, I'm going."
Yeah, and then
And I don't care if I have to die to go, I'm going.
And that's what happened.
And that's what happened. Yeah. And so you cannot hide. Like, when people get married here, I go, look, y'all have picked a couple to get married on their land that you could not, like, if you had a marriage, if you thought about a marriage, you could not fathom having a better couple to pattern your marriage, because they were the blueprint. I'm telling you right now. Like, that's it. You don't get, she was with him every step of the way.
Amazing couple.
Yes. And
amazing marriage.
This game-changing law, I know it's the smallest law, but it changes everything. Because we have this executive order 8802, and that executive order has to do with government contracts. That is the executive order that said a certain percentage of minorities would have to be on a government contract in order for it to be awarded to a company. And that happened in 1941. So when we think of affirmative action, we think of it in the 60s. When this happened in 1941. Yes.
Early 40s.
Yes. And then we have CORE. Now, we hear about cancel culture today, but this was the original cancel culture group. Okay? CORE was using economics as a way to protest being treated like second-class citizens. And when you hear about CORE and all the things they did, it took about 20 years, it was 20 years of them really hardcore doing this. But they were the group that said, no, picket, sit at these counters at Woolworths. No, we're going to picket, we're not going to buy products here, we're not going to do this, boycotts, everything, so that people who were being treated unfairly would get the equal treatment from people, because you're not going to get my money if you don't allow me to work there and you don't allow me to shop there. So that's a big step when we think about how economics plays a part in what goes on. And then we have the Smith versus Albright decision, which turned the Dixiecrats, who were a Southern party who said that they were a social club, into the Democrats after they were sued by Thurgood Marshall. And that's the party that we start registering in to vote. And that's how Mr. Moore started the Progressive Voters League. And don't forget all the investigations he did when it came to lynchings in Florida, because although we don't think of Florida as being a southern state, they have the highest number of lynchings per capita.
No, we think of Florida being a southern state.
Most people don't. It's really been Disneyfied because of all of the money that has been poured into tourism here, and people really don't look at Florida because so many people are in and out and it's a transient state as it being a southern state, but it is. And then he started the Progressive Voters League with his friend Edward Davis. Now, the Progressive Voters League was the political part in Brevard County that was able to register over 116 people to vote throughout the state of Florida. Not only did they register them to vote, but they took them to the polls to
Souls to the polls, the first one. Huh?
Yes, they took them so that they would really be able to use that vote. And it changed the political makeup of Florida. And that's when he and his wife were fired. It says that they resigned, but they weren't really offered a new contract the next year because of all the things that they were doing to change the political makeup of Florida. Now, of course, we know last year in February that the school board came and they gave the proclamation, and that is why we have this information being put into the school system. They're going to learn about the Moors throughout their education process in Brevard County. Also, also the Moors will be known as teachers emeritus, which means that they will always appear on the payroll. But the biggest thing is that now we have young minds, 8th grade students coming out here and taking a tour of this facility. And that is going to be the biggest game changer. And it's not just about learning about the Moors. It's about learning what happened from 1860 to 1964. It's all those things that we don't really get to learn in a classroom, in a setting like this. We're talking about American history. We're talking about amendments. We're talking about the institution of colleges and universities that have Black studies. We're talking about all the things that happen that really make the fabric of America that we don't really get to see because textbooks don't really teach that. And so now they're going to have that opportunity to learn it and absorb it and know that they can come here and reference it at any time. And that's the most important part, I think. Just getting those young minds to get this information and know that this is the fabric of America.
Good. That's awesome.
Yes, and we don't often talk about, well, he does start, he gets this executive secretary position. He's the of the Florida State Conference. And this is the first time we have a paid position by the NAACP, which changes everything. Because if they were smarter, the school board would have just given him an extra job, but given him all the time that he needs, and now he's getting paid to set up chapters of the NAACP throughout the state of Florida. Well, that's what really sets him on fire, because now he was doing this for free, and now he's getting paid to do it. That even makes it better for him. And so we see Jackie Robinson, and we don't think of him as having anything to do with Central Florida. But... Hello.
Sanford, Daytona Beach.
Thank you. I want to tell the story because that's really...
You want to tell it?
That's really precious part of the story.
You tell it. We at your place. Go ahead. Let him know.
Sanford refused to give him food or lodging.
Say what?
Yes.
And then the Klan ran him out the stadium.
And then and they ended up having to go to Daytona Beach.
And that's where he made history.
And that's where he played the integrated game, and that's where they named the stadium after him. And I don't think that people really know that part when they talk about...
they gonna know it now, don't they?
When they talk about Jackie Robinson, they don't think he has any ties to Florida, but we knew he had ties to Florida, but now everybody else does too.
That's right.
That tie to Florida really, and Central Florida at that, not somewhere off, right here in Central Florida, you start to see a lot of change happen and started right here. And then we have this executive order 9981. And I don't think that most people know that that had to do with the integration of the military during the time that we were having World War II, because Germany had developed a radar that could detect fighter pilot planes before they got close enough to drop their bombs. Well, these firefighters, these pilots that could fly undetected were actually the Tuskegee Airmen. So when we talk about them, it is the actual 99th Squadron that fought in the war. I don't think people know that Tuskegee had a series of airmen.
Yes, it wasn't just one.
It wasn't just one, but the 99th Squadron is the one that flew and fought in the war. And we try to make a distinction. I don't think people make a distinction between them because they just say Tuskegee Airmen, but there were different squadrons. There was 100, 101, there was 103. And until they closed the base, they had a squadron of Tuskegee Airmen. So I want you to be clear about that. And their importance was the integration of the military. And so from that point on, the military was integrated, and that's how we fought.
And not just integrated, but roles given that weren't just being the
Power
cooks
positions.
or the janitors.
No, they were being given, military stripes, which is really like they moved to from an E6 to an E10. I have military children. So I know about these rankings, and so it was very important for them to have men that looked like them or women that looked like them, that were their sergeants, that were their corporals, that were, the general. And we have a man Chappie, who was the first general.
Yeah, they have a new museum in North Florida,
Yes,
Pensacola to be.
because he was from Pensacola.
Yeah, Chappie
but
Museum.
as you can see, Central Florida Florida in general has a lot of rich history when it comes to being first and being when it comes to Black people, and
That's
we
right.
don't really celebrate that history because we talk about we do here at our museum, but as a people we don't celebrate the history because it's not being taught to us. So we really have to make a concerted effort to teach our next generations this information and really follow through with going to these museums, talking about these things, and imparting this knowledge into them, because we want them to be thankful for the position that they're in, but they don't know how they got there, and they don't know all that it took to get them there. And if we don't give them that information, they take it for granted. So we got to really start doing our homework here. We got to start changing some things. But we also have the Rosewood 4, which is a very big case. When our governor, DeSantis, came into office, he actually pardoned them. And then their family went for exoneration that they finally got in November of last year. So the Groveland 4 were finally pardoned. Exonerated for everything. So they did not commit this crime, yet they were punished for it. And I think that's so important that we follow up on these cases. So much has been lost and so much has been done, and no one is really going through. But this family went through and they followed it all the way to the end, and they are now exonerated. They never committed this crime. A man was lynched by a mob led by Sheriff Willis McCall when he got on the bus, which was what he was there doing anyway. He was waiting to get on the bus, and he was accused of raping Norma Paget and assaulting her husband, Willie. And so we see that this story is like a lot of the stories that we hear in all of these small towns, is that they were accused of a crime, they were convicted of this crime by an all-white jury, and then they were sentenced very heavily. The youngest one, Charlie Greenlee, got 25 years. Irving and Shepard, life. They got the death penalty. They paid the penalty with their life. And when they went to the Florida Supreme Court, it was just a rubber stamp. They didn't even say, hey, you may have did this wrong, you may have did this wrong. No, they agreed with the sheriff. But when they went to the U.S. Supreme Court, very different standards. And this is why it's so important that we know our levels of government and know our level of what we can and can't do. Because when they went to the Supreme Court definitely said, hey, listen, you cannot have a jury in a community with no blacks on the jury. And we have a town with all of these black people in it, right? Secondly, you cannot have the sheriff going to the press, having a whole conversation about what he thinks happened before he even picks the jury, confessing and saying that he actually had the confessions of guilt from these people and really didn't have it. Who does that? And then the Orlando Sentinel, the next day after these boys were arrested, put on the front page 4 electric chairs with the words Groveland Boys written across it, giving the image to everybody who saw it that they were guilty.
Yeah.
So they tainted the jury pool before we could even pick a jury. And then on top of that, when he was asked to show the confessions of guilt, he didn't have them. And so what ends up happening is they get a new trial. He's very unhappy about it. He's so unhappy about it that he actually has a rebuttal for the Supreme Court. Never heard of it, but hey, we are in the South. And he says through his attorney that they were being let off on a technicality. But then he got so angry that the attorney wasn't saying what he wanted him to say that he started speaking. And he said that he accused the Supreme Court of being influenced by the NAACP's sensational lies and bowing to their subversive influence. So he was very angry about what had happened when they got the new trial. It doesn't really matter because he took it upon himself to take these prisoners to their new trial in Tiberias. And what happens next is why Mr. Moore gets involved. On taking them to their new trial, he claims that his tire went flat. But we know now that that's not necessarily what happened. And he claims that because he had to pull over in the middle of nowhere and change the tire, the two gentlemen asked to relieve themselves. And then when he opened the door, they attacked him and tried to run away. And we probably would have believed this story, but guess what? One of the men survived. So this is picture 3 of like 40-something pictures. They did a full-scale investigation at the site until one of the news people realized that one of the men was not dead. He was moving. So they called the ambulance. But the ambulance doesn't pick him up. Instead, they pick up McCall. They call the undertaker to pick up the man and his friend who is actually dead. The undertaker takes him to the hospital because it is illegal for black people to ride in an ambulance in Lake County. And that is the sad part. This is what happens when things are separate. When they take him to the hospital, despite everything that's happened, he recovers. And when he tells his story, it is a much different story than McCall. He says that McCall actually pulled over and took the back access road because it was a unpaved road so he could pretend that his tire went flat. Then he actually pulls over in the middle of nowhere, opens the back door, and shoots Shepard squarely in the forehead, killing him. Said in fear for his life, he has to hide behind his friend's lifeless body.
My God.
He says he shoots still. He's so angry that he cannot get a good shot of him that he takes Shepard's lifeless body and throws it out of the car onto the ground. And because they are handcuffed by their wrist and ankle, he goes with him. Could you just imagine in that moment living that? And then he says he shoots him 2 times, point blank, while he was lying on the ground, unable to move. And he says he pretends to be dead just so he won't kill him. Can you imagine that?
No.
And then I was just like, when you hear this story, like you're like, oh my God. When you're reading these pages, it's like all coming in your mind to life that this man was lying there hoping not to die at the hands of this sheriff who's supposed to be elected to serve as a protector. And he hears him radio for the deputy sheriff to come. The deputy sheriff shows up and beats him up. Then he notices that he is still breathing. And what does he do? He shoots him in the neck. And all of this is corroborated on the FBI reports when you're reading about the Moore case. So you start to realize that law enforcement was complicit. Everybody along every step along the way, people were complicit in just covering up all types of atrocities that had happened to Black people. And that was like, like when I was reading, I was just like, I can't believe this happened. And I'm so happy that the family was able to get the exoneration that they got. Because if I was his family, I would have been just so angry, livid. There was no word that could really express how I would have felt about this situation. Because they don't look at these people as being fathers, husbands, none of that. They just look at them as being the enemy.
During the Groveland 4 case, did Thurgood Marshall come to stay with the Moores as well again?
The first case, he came and stayed with the Moores, and he went over the next day. They drove over to Groveland to talk to them about what had happened to them. And what was interesting is that when he came back to do the second case, after they had won the appeal, Mr. Moore was no longer there. That is crazy. I just can't imagine having a friend. And then on the 25th of December, that's when the bomb was placed under the right side of the home, underneath the floorboards, and the bomb went off on December 25th, their 25th wedding anniversary, and Christmas Day. So you can see people writing about it. You can see the investigation. You can see the flowers that people had to send, and they had to bring them in from Miami because no florist in this area would ever send pictures for a Black man. And as I told you, the communists came here. 16 people came in and visited for Mr.
That I didn't know. The Russians,
yes. And then one of them got up and spoke, and we talk about the great gala that they held. This is when all of those grassroots efforts really galvanized behind Mr. Moore. The NAACP and the Ballad of Harry Moore was written by Langston Hughes, was spoken there. And we see immediately the funding for the bus boycotts and the Brown decision happen. And we see Martin Luther King Jr. Here and giving his famous speech that A. Philip Randolph and Aretha Franklin had asked him to give because they heard it at a rally earlier. And then we see Lyndon B. Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act into existence after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And the only addendum to it is the 1965 Voters' Rights Act. And that ends the civil rights movement as we know it.
And their beautiful museum. The picture down here on the floor is beautiful.
Yes, that was given to us by one of the retiring provosts at Eastern Florida State College, which was formerly BCC. She had it in her office, and she thought it would be more useful to bring it to us than leave it in her, have it at her house.
Beautiful.
She also donated that chain and ball, the slave anchor. So that was one of the things, the two things that we acquired.
Beautiful. And the cases. People come into the museum, the first thing they ask some children to say, what is this?
Yes.
The typewriter.
It's a typewriter. Yeah. It's very interesting. I said, that's how they used to type things out.
Beautiful job, Lala.
Oh, you're welcome.
Beautiful story.
Thank you.
We have to thank Miss Lala for giving us a tour, plus the reasons behind this museum and why it's so important. And let me step in front of the camera and I just see a voice. But why it's so important for Black history.
Yes.
Why it's so important for American history.
Yes,
and why we should all learn about the great Harry and Harriette V. Moore.
Yes.
and the Moore legacy. And we thank you.
Thank you.
No, we thank you for everything. We thank you for all these tours. We thank you for keeping that legacy alive.
Yes, I really
And
like
told
talking
to the next generation, told to everybody there. So this was a virtual museum tour of the Harry T. and Harriette V. Moore complex here in Brevard County. Please set up a visit, part of our FAPN, Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network. Thank you again, Lala. Thank you to Miss Sonya. We will see y'all back again, and happy Black History Month.
Happy Black History Month.